My name is CB Madhukar. I'm CEO of Co-Develop. Co-Develop is a new initiative about a year old, essentially trying to help countries think through infrastructure thinking. Essentially, what does it take for them to set up systems in a way that's not duplicative, that don't create silos, and can be useful to transform both government and the private sector across the world.
I was also wondering, there's a lot of conversation these days around using digital public goods and digital public infrastructure for helping government accelerate progress towards positive development outcomes. But there's quite a lot of ambiguity about what those terms are, and they're fairly new as well. Could you just help us understand what the terms digital public good and digital public infrastructure means, perhaps with a few examples from the work that Co-Develop is doing?
Yeah, let me explain this somewhat conceptually. In the brick and mortar economy, we're all used to almost taking for granted that several services are shared amongst all sectors of the economy, both public and the private sector. And the classic example would be, let's say, roads. Not each ministry is trying to set up its own road infrastructure. And the education department and the health department and every other department use the same routes, right? But in the digital world, what is happening is that every department, every agency, every city wants to create its own silos. And unlike in the physical world, what's happening is that they're rebuilding the same things rather than reusing the same artifacts across these different silos. What this does is it creates a lot of duplication, a waste of public resources, and just to be focused on the climate issue here, increase the carbon footprint enormously, both because of energy consumption and a whole bunch of other related issues. So there's a smarter way of doing it, and through our lessons in India, we've learned how to think infrastructure, and therefore we're taking the idea to several countries around the world. To both make public spending much more thoughtful and careful, but also have outsized impact on development outcomes.
So when you say digital public infrastructure, does it have some basic building blocks or certain kind of key characteristics or components, just to help our audience imagine what a DPI might look like?
So the nature of infrastructure, digital or otherwise, is that it can enable a whole bunch of actors to leverage the infrastructure, number one. Number two, it's often interoperable. A car can use the same thing, same road as the ambulance and so on. Similarly, interoperability is a feature of a lot of digital public infrastructure. Also, taking a minimalist view that if I want to run a transport system in a country, I'm not building the roads and the trucks and the cars and the buses. I'm just building the roads, and somebody else will offer the other service. Having that imagination that I want to build the bare minimum that I need to build so that others can build on top. That thinking is very critical and doesn't come naturally in many segments of our work. And I think those are some key features of what we think of as digital infrastructure thinking that I hope we all can sort of embrace and leverage around the world.
In this context, when you use the road analogy, what would the road be in the context of digital public infrastructure? Is it around a data exchange mechanism? Is it around a kind of tech stack that enables that interoperability and a number of actors to use these services on top of it, or build services on top of it?
Yeah, I think there are some foundational layers in digital public infrastructure. The foundational layers are often, ID and instant payment systems, data exchange between entities, registries, for instance. Every entity has a registry, government or otherwise. And so these are all common artifacts that keep getting rebuilt. And therefore, our sort of point is, can we have these as horizontal layers? And there's for education, something else you might need to build on top. For healthcare, you might need to build something on top. And that's all possible and useful. But to rebuild the entire stack every time is just counterproductive. And that's the general thinking.
Right. That really helps. Thank you. Maybe just moving this conversation along into the climate question. What potential do you see for using digital public infrastructure or digital public goods for climate action? Perhaps you could share some examples or even some speculative use cases that a co-developer or other partners might be working on.
While climate has been an issue that has sort of been plaguing us for some time, we haven't yet done enough thinking collectively on how we can use digital infrastructure for climate. And over the last few months, we've been working with several stakeholders from around the world to imagine what that could look like. There are some early sort of formulations that I can share here, not strongly held, but evolving. The first is, there are broadly, as we see it, three parts to the climate story. One is a climate data collection effort. The second is the carbon sort of, carbon trading, and how do you compensate marginal farmers and so on and so forth. I think that's the second piece. The third is the engineering of solar and wind turbines and so on, which doesn't quite lend itself to the work we are doing. But on the first two, I think we have a choice to make, whether we have some private sector folks come and set up measurement systems of climate measurement systems around the world, and then colonize this data and sell this data to others, which is one model. But the other model could be, are there some commons we can set up that collect and make data available almost as a public resource, public good, so such that everybody benefits from around the world without having to pay for something as basic as climate data. And I might liken this to, let's say, the Met Department or the National Weather Service that collects data from around the country and then makes it available for all TV channels and so on and so forth. So it's a public good that everyone can leverage. That's one approach, the one question that we're thinking about in the climate space. The second one is on payments to people, farmers and so on, or people affected by climate disasters. And that's a classic, government to people payments infrastructure. Whether it's in agriculture, healthcare, whatever you do, climate disasters are, as you know, are on the rise, and most governments don't have good infrastructure to disburse timely cash to people when they're affected. And so we're trying to see how digital public infrastructure can actually address some of these concerns that no doubt the world is facing right now.
That's something we found in our research as well, the issue around the lack of climate data and the lack of access to climate data by those stakeholders who need it most. And then, of course, the issue around helping people adapt and build resilience through payments. So I think those are really, really compelling examples. Are there some challenges or risks that you see as we try and build these systems out, or roadblocks as we build these systems out for climate action?
There are definite roadblocks. I think the challenge is, how do you make sure that you build systems that are inclusive? Because it's easy to build a system, but if you haven't thought through how to make it inclusive, then you're disenfranchising the population that perhaps needs it the most. And so there are some design features that are possible. Nothing is foolproof, but I'll give you an example from India, where if you have a smartphone, you can use digital payments and access cash. If you have a feature phone, you can do it. If you have no phone, you can still do it with your thumbprint, which is the Aadhaar enabled payment system. And so that's a design feature. And so when governments think about making available digital cash transfers to people in need during disasters, you can't expect everyone to have a phone. How do you design for that? So that's a roadblock, but also not insurmountable. The other is, how do you prevent aggregators, intermediaries that suck out, commission of every transaction that the government wants to give to the people? And how do you think about this in infrastructure terms, in decentralized network terms rather than platform terms? And those are, again, design challenges that, we have some ideas on, and things are getting built out in India, and I'm sure we'll travel to many parts of the world soon. The third is, the risks of data aggregation and collection and so on. The increasingly we see these risks more as trade-offs rather than risks alone. And the reason is, anything we do on any day, when we wake up in the morning, we are having to make these constant trade-offs. How much data do I give up to the mobile phone that I'm using, or do I take a car or risk an accident? And so, but fortunately, over these millennia that we've all lived, we've all figured out how to think about trade-offs much more constructively and creatively. So we are not paralyzed by the idea of risks, and actually think about how we balance out the risks and the benefits we get. So I think the mindset that we'll probably need is really what kind of trade-off mindset we bring to this discussion rather than just risks.
How do you see this space evolving over the next 10 to 15 years in the Asian context? Any kind of provocations for our audience, as we're also going to be engaging in a futuring exercise over the next day?
15 years is a really long time, in the sense that the things are moving and changing so quickly that we might need to think in 2-year installments, right? What can we get done in the next 2 years and the next 2 years and the next 2 years? Because technology and our capabilities are changing so dramatically that it's almost impossible to take a 15-year view on climate or anything for that matter. And so I would say, we can take what can we do before the end of 2025 as an example, right? 24 and 25, what can we get done? And similarly, take 2-year, 1-year installments and actually put ourselves under that sort of, lens of wanting to get something done well, but quickly enough so it's actually meaningful to people. 15 years, a lot of people are dead.
So what would be your 2-year horizon for the DPI and climate space in Asia?
Yeah. We're trying to think about a couple of, initiatives that could actually show some meaningful, reach and impact in the next 2 years. We're trying to build a climate resilience infrastructure stack, and also we've begun conversations with smaller countries, island nations that are at high risk for climate, and saying, can we make this like a managed services plug and play model, which you can then take and build on for your own context, but there's at least a core offering that you can quickly leverage and actually start using. And these are early conversations, but my hunch is that from these early conversations, seems like there may be many countries that might want to take the stack and say, how do I get into business today, as opposed to wait for another 5-10 years to set up ID and payments and whatever else that we typically might expect. So we need some innovative thinking collectively on our part to say, how do we get something that is scalable? How do we get something that is immediately useful and it won't take 6 years for it to be useful? How do we think about population scale solutions for each of these contexts, and how do we make it possible for governments and the private sector to come together and figure out solutions that they can offer today, without, of course, creating silos, keeping it interoperable, and making sure it's not, we don't have too many middlemen aggregating stuff and taking commissions away and so on and so forth. I think these are standard challenges we all have, and the more we can put our heads together, the better off we'll all be.
Just a final question from me on the climate resilient kind of tech stack that you're working on over the next couple of years. Could you give some indication of what this stack would comprise, and what the kind of sources of data might be, as well as who might be some of the key stakeholders and applications that you expect to emerge from this?
Yeah, I think the data, I think the hard work in any of these pieces of work is creating the beneficiary registry, and that is an in-country exercise, often very political. And if we can get the registry, that the names of beneficiaries right, the tech is the easy part, right? And therefore, I think the thing that we would urge both government, civil society, private sector, anyone who's participating in this, how can we build clean registries of people who really need this help when the disaster strikes, or farmers who need to get payments for climate-related issues and so on. The tech is easy part. We've got a broad blueprint for what we call a G2P Connect up and running, which I think encapsulates many of the features that a climate resilience infrastructure might also will need. And so we can go into lots of detail on that, but I'm happy to take that offline and discuss it.